Hi. Good afternoon. I'm Ellen McKenzie. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Health Policy and Management here at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. And it's my honor and privilege to welcome you all to the 18th annual Daniel Raskin Memorial Symposium on Injury Prevention. And I think we're all very much looking forward to today's symposium on an incredibly interesting and fascinating topic. We got a little preview over lunch, and I know myself, I have lots and lots of questions, but it should be fascinating. We're very pleased that this year's Raskin Lecture is part of a year-long celebration of the school's centennial. Those of you who are visiting the school, we are celebrating our 100th birthday this year, and we decided as a school we were going to celebrate the entire year, and that's what we're doing. And each month at the school, one or two departments are highlighted. The work of one or two departments are highlighted, and the month of March is the Department of Health Policy and Management, together with, I think, the Department of Biochemistry. So they paired two very different departments together. But anyway, we're delighted that the Raskin Lecture can be highlighted as one of our signature events that highlights the work of our department. Andrew Gielan will be talking in a minute and speak about Danny Raskin's lifelong commitment to transportation safety and injury prevention. But we want to first take a minute and thank the Raskin family for making this symposium possible. And we have with us today Joan Raskin, who is Danny's aunt. And we really appreciate your being able to come and join us and really witness Danny's legacy through your generous contribution to the school and to the Center for Injury Research and Policy. So we thank you very, very much. For almost 2 decades, the endowment that was established by the Raskin family in Danny's memory has enabled us to bring together experts from around the country to tackle some of the most challenging and interesting questions in transportation safety, in injury and fire prevention, and today is no exception. And I think Danny would be very thrilled to see us all gathered here together to tackle an interesting and emerging different kind of a issue in transportation safety. So with that short introduction, I do want to hand over the mic to Andrew Gielan, who's the director of the Center for Injury Research and Policy, who will tell us a little bit about Danny and why we're here today celebrating his life, and then we'll introduce our panel. Andrew?
Thank you. Thank you, Ellen. I'm very happy to be here today and to welcome you to today's symposium honoring the life and work of Daniel J. Raskin. I echo Ellen's thanks and appreciation to the Raskin family and welcome Joan here. We're delighted that you're here and we're very, very grateful for all your support. Let me tell you a little bit about Danny and why his memory and this symposium is so important to our injury center. Danny was a human factors investigator at the National Transportation Safety Board. NTSB may be familiar to you as you see the results of their work every time there's a serious transportation crash. It's an independent U.S. federal government agency that's been charged with determining the probable cause of transportation accidents, promoting safety, and assisting victims and their families. Danny's position with the NTSB investigating crashes was just one of the ways that he dedicated his life to keeping people safe. He was also a volunteer firefighter in the Baltimore County Chestnut Ridge Volunteer Fire Company. And the county volunteers undergo the same training as career firefighters, and Danny's skills in both firefighting and transportation safety were complementary and highly regarded by his colleagues at both NTSB and in Baltimore County. Danny's colleagues described him as extremely caring and a most well-liked person. Sadly, Danny died at age 31 on July 16, 1990, as the result of head injuries suffered while fighting a barn fire. While Lieutenant Raskin was trying to get water to the burning barn, a 50-pound iron fitting mounted on the front of the fire truck suddenly broke loose. It whipped around and knocked him to the ground, his helmet coming off and resulting in a fatal head injury. First Lieutenant Daniel J. Raskin has been memorialized at the National Fire Academy in Emmitsburg, at the Baltimore County Fire Memorial in Towson, at his fire company in Chestnut Ridge, and in the Congressional Record. Memorials for Danny have been established at the Maryland Shock Trauma Center, at McDonough School, and with NTSB's planting of a forest in Israel in his name. Clearly a well-loved and regarded individual who is sorely missed by all who knew him. The Injury Center is indeed honored to host the Memorial Symposium to celebrate Danny's life and to call attention to the problem of preventable injuries. Whether those injuries are related to occupational hazards, fires and burns, or unsafe transportation. These injuries have been high priorities for our center faculty as we seek to reduce their burden by closing the gap between research and practice. Thanks to almost 30 years of funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, our multidisciplinary faculty, staff, and students conduct research on injuries and violence, provide training, and support the practice community. Our work spans research on causes of injuries as well as policies and programs designed to prevent them. And our faculty study injuries affecting every age group from sudden infant death to falls in older adults, and injuries that occur in the workplace, the home, on the roads, and in the community. We evaluate ways to prevent injury, and when that's not possible, to promote the best possible trauma care and rehabilitation. A shining star in our education and training portfolio is the Daniel J. Raskin Memorial Symposium, and this year's event is particularly exciting. We have an amazing agenda for the afternoon. First, we'll hear from Dr. Mark Rosekind, Administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, who will provide a brief overview of motor vehicle safety and the game changer that is autonomous vehicles. Dr. Rosekind will then introduce our distinguished lineup of experts on autonomous vehicles who will provide their diverse perspectives on the future and what's coming down the road. No pun intended. Good, you got it. All right, So, without further ado, I would love to introduce Dr. Mark Rosekind and turn the session over to him. Dr. Rosekind was sworn in as the 15th Administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration on December 22, 2014. In his role as administrator, Dr. Rosekind is pursuing NHTSA's core safety mission, which is saving lives, preventing injuries, and reducing crashes through all of the tools available to the agency, which include public awareness campaigns, technical innovations, research into human behavior, and their enforcement authority. Before coming to NHTSA, Dr. Rosekind was the 40th member of the National Transportation Safety Board from 2010 to 2014. He was nominated to NHTSA and to the NTSB by President Obama and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Administrator Rosekind is a passionate safety professional dedicated to enhancing transportation safety for the traveling public, and we're just delighted and so honored to have him here with us this afternoon. So, Dr. Rosekind.
Good afternoon. I'm a sleep guy, actually, if you read the bio, so we're going to do that one more time. Good afternoon. Let's check in, because we got a really lively panel coming. So I do want to make sure you're here. But just a couple of starts. One is Danny Raskin. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here for this particular symposium, because we're talking 25 years. The way you keep people's memories alive is to do this kind of thing. And I think there are a lot of people I worked with at the NHTSA that knew Danny, and they still talk so affectionately about the work that he did. So it's pretty neat to come and actually participate in something like this. Second thing to get started, happy birthday, 100 years, pretty cool. But also what's a big part of the emphasis is not just looking back for the celebration, but what's coming forward. So you don't get any more forward-looking than self-driving cars, right? So what a great place to start. The third thing is full disclosure. I will just admit that I am the outlier in my family. My wife is a Hopkins Harriet Lane pediatric trained intern and resident, and my daughter is a 15 graduate of Hopkins. So I can just tell you that even though I don't have that degree, I may be the outlier, but I've come to love the institution. So getting the invitation to come here and be able to do this is just great. It's how I've gotten to know Dean Wendland and other folks that are here. That's just been great to interact with you folks, which is why we're excited about this afternoon. All I'm going to do is provide about 10 minutes of sort of context of how we think about these things, and then introduce what I consider one of the most prominent and knowledgeable panels that you will get a chance to hear from. They're all saying like, us? Yeah, these guys are really... So I'm going to just take a few minutes. We're from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and I think having a context for why we're so excited about different types of automated safety technologies, and then this context will help you sort of understand why the stuff you're going to hear about this afternoon is literally the not cutting edge or leading edge, but the bleeding edge. That's a Silicon Valley term of literally the hottest stuff that's out there from people who really know this. So just a few things for context. You know what's interesting, I think, is transportation's invisible to us now. It has so penetrated our lives because it touches everybody every single day. What's kind of interesting is we experiencing it at every moment, and yet what's really interesting, we also have this A to B every time safely, shouldn't be a bother. So when you think about it's ubiquitous, yeah, it's invisible actually to most of us. At NHTSA though, we have a very specific perception about why we care about it, and that has to do with the lives that are lost on our roadways. And so NHTSA has a very pure mission. It's to save those lives, prevent the injuries, if we can, eliminate all the crashes that are going on. Now, what's interesting for me when I got to NHTSA, you heard December 22nd, 2014, hasn't been very long. What's been amazing to me is the portfolio that's at NHTSA. And so while we're going to talk about some very specific things within autonomous vehicles, what's interesting is EMS 911 falls under. We provide huge amounts of money to the states for them to do their safety work. Impaired driving, which we've added a fourth D, which is not just drunk, drugged, distracted, but now drowsy. Seat belts, car seats, all of these all fall under NHTSA. So the portfolio for the safety week we're due is really tremendous. But I wanted to start here for the thing that's really critical to us. Everybody at NHTSA can give you that number, 32,675, because all of us scientists, engineers, we're data-driven, but every one of those numbers is a life. And so they're a father, daughter, son, you know this. And that's why we want to make sure we know that number. And it's always interesting to me when people are like, well, it's over 30,000. It's like, it's 32,675. What's interesting is those numbers are actually from 2014. And the thing that's also fascinating, so there's your injuries and crashes, but the other part is we lose most of the lives in transportation actually on our roadways. So that's kind of interesting too, where you think about where is the biggest chance for us to save those lives, it's on our roadways. So that's the number from 2014. And what's really interesting is when we've done analysis that looks at what's the last cause, reason for the crash to occur, 94% of the time it's the human. And it's slash up there, but it's a human error or a choice. They're looking here when they should have been looking there, or a choice they made, which is don't wear a seatbelt. Drink something, get behind the wheel. Don't sleep, get behind the wheel, right? Take your medication, but not know could make you drowsy. And so what's interesting is there are human, just how we're designed as humans, errors that are created because of that. There are other times we make choices. One of the highlights, I always give people example. Anyone know what none of the NHTSA people can answer. What's the average, sort of when we look at the national percentage of people wearing seatbelts now? Any idea? 85. It's 87, just gone up to about 88%. Of the 32,675 who lost their lives, 50% were not wearing their seatbelt. Okay? So we're doing great as a nation, but when you look at the lives that are lost, half of them aren't wearing their seatbelts. Okay? So I bring this up because it ends up a huge part of our ability to try and save those lives. 94% of them is here in the human. Okay? So what are the others, just so people know? 2% go to defect recalls, in spite of the headlines that you see about all that. What's the other 2%? Environment. Okay? So that's everything from roadways to weather that's going on. So what about 2015? We put numbers out as estimates. We collect this from all over the country. Right now, at 6 months, it was about 8.1%, and now we're looking at about 9.3% at 9 months into the year. So why is this significant? Because if you look at the data, it ends up, over the last 10 years, it's been incredible, a 25% reduction in the number of fatalities on our roadways. But if we look at the end of this 2015 and we're at about 10%, we've just lost a third to a half of that progress over the last decade. So what that tells you is, for this last bullet here, is we got to keep doing everything we know that works, but I don't have to define insanity for you, right? So if we keep doing the same stuff and expect we're going to eventually get to zero, it's not going to happen just doing what we're doing. We need new tools. We need new approaches. And I do just my one comment, which is, if you think about it from a safety perspective, zero, in fact, is the only appropriate target, right? So 0 deaths on our roadways is the only acceptable objective for us. How do we get there? And I don't mind telling you, I have all these statisticians that I work with that are incredible. When you pose to them, okay, if you just look at how we've been doing and then we're up and we go down, how long could it take us, right? Model that for me. And their heads explode. We can't do that. We don't have enough data. But what they will tell me is decades and decades and hundreds of thousands more lives before we get to zero. I hope there is no one in this room that accepts that as being okay. So we need to figure out what else can we do. What's really interesting is we actually know something that does really well for us. This is data that was looked at over 52 years. What those lines just show you, I'm at Hopkins, I can use data. The blue line basically is how fatalities have been going over time. See that nice decrease? You know what that red line is? Those are the lives saved from technology. In fact, you know how many? That's a pretty big number, 613,501 lives. So there's a list of about 14 specific technologies related to the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards that are rules, basically, of how cars are built and the other things that are out there to save our lives. Of those 14, seatbelts are at the top, airbags are next, the stuff you'd expect. But technology is a proven, over the last 50 years, if we look, it is a proven way for us to go after saving those lives. There's no question when we think about the choices. And by the way, we still have to think about the humans and how we affect what we do, but everyone in this room knows that changing human behavior is really hard. Not that we can't do it, but again, we got to keep doing what we know. We have to apply new stuff where we can, but we have to look for new tools. Technology clearly is one of those tools. And so on a foundation of a model that NHTSA uses all the time, which is strong laws, enforcement, high visibility enforcement of those laws, and education and awareness, that saves lives. Proven method, been using it for decades. What we need to do is figure out what else is available. Right now at NHTSA, we have two paths we're focused on. Technology, safety technologies, which fall into a lot of categories. I'm just going to show you 3 slides about those, but also what we're calling human choices, which is trying to reinforce everything we're already doing. And we just came back from 5 summits all over the country, and in these regional summits, we basically explored what aren't we doing, what I called the unusual suspects. So what are the folks in public health, in marketing, in political decision making? How do we take the work that they do and apply it to traffic safety, save more lives from a behavioral standpoint? These are 2 paths. I just want to highlight NHTSA basically has a model when you think of automated technologies from 1 to 4. One of my questions for Nat is going to be, is it 5 or is it 4? We think 4. So 0 is none, but basically 1 kind of automation, very specific, up to fully autonomous. But there's a spectrum. We have these different 4 levels, okay? When you read the newspaper, almost everybody tries to talk about level 4, fully self-driving cars, but there's a lot of other safety technologies that are out there. And I bring that up because if you look at a vehicle, they're literally all over the place, okay? Because what's interesting when people say, what's the new technology? Well, which one are you talking about? The forward collision part, the lane departure, the lane keeping, the rear visibility camera. There's all kinds of technologies that are out there. And so what's interesting right now is just seeing the range of new technologies that are focused on safety, helping us in those crashes should they occur. That's why the next one that's interesting is one of the things that Department of Transportation and NHTSA has really pushed is connected automation. So vehicle to vehicle, V to V, V to I, vehicle to infrastructure. How can we get the cars talking to each other? And why that's so relevant is that means cars can look around the corner. They can look ahead. They can literally see a hard braking from somebody who's on a different intersection. Okay? So this V2V kind of capability goes far beyond what an individual car can do, but adds a system capability, basically, and you see these 4 different examples of things that can basically help you in a safety situation. So we've got all these technologies, all the way up to self-driving, and we have connected versions, or connected automation, that allows a whole nother level of safety opportunity, right? And then the other thing I like to highlight here is people think about all these things related to the vehicle safety per se, but one of the things that's really exciting is this. driver alcohol detection system safety. And what this is basically 2 sensor systems that have been now put into a piece of technology that can literally, from a finger, touch, or breath that you see here, determine if alcohol is in your system. And if you were above the legal limit, 0.08 anywhere in the country, you couldn't start your car. So Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, other people that do drunk driving research, realize this could be the seatbelt for drunk driving, okay? And there's a lot of interest in this, but this is an example of a safety technology that isn't quite the same as some of the other things we're talking about. So safety technology really has a very broad array of opportunities for us. And that's why I'm just going to finish last 2 things here. Ready? Right now, NHTSA has stepped into this really interesting arena in several different ways. So in January, the Secretary Fox at the Department of Transportation said that NHTSA would be doing the following 4 things in the next 6 months. So one thing we're going to be doing is literally giving guidance on how to deploy these safely on the road, autonomous vehicles and automated safety technologies. The second thing you see there is create model state policy. So one of the challenges right now is every state gets to do what it wants. And in Europe, they've already said they have a problem because there's a patchwork. We don't want that patchwork in the United States. How do we create that? The third thing you see there is this technology is being created and evolving so quickly. If we think about just regulation or other things as the way to help this develop, we're going to get in the way and it'll be too late. So by the time the new technology comes out, if you're waiting for rulemaking, you're on version 8 point something before the rule actually comes out. So we need new authorities and tools for us to help get this kind of new safety technology on the road, making sure it meets its safety potential. And the last thing you see there is we actually have some authorities and we're figuring out how to apply those now. So actually for Google, General Motors, and for BMW, we've come out with interpretations that help things move forward. I hope you'll hear about that today, because one of the ones that hit the news was when we let Google know that the operating system of an autonomous vehicle could be considered the driver. Okay? So boy, is that going to be fun to talk about, right? Here's the last piece to talk about the transition. This is the most transformative moment in the auto industry in probably the last 100 years for what you see on this slide. Up until now, it's always been about, well, let's reduce the severity, okay? Or, if it's going to happen, we'll mitigate the injury, or afterwards, let's save those lives, okay? Now, don't let it happen in the first place. Now, a lot of what we're looking at are safety technologies that will prevent that crash from ever occurring. We've totally flipped the approach to safety on our roadways. This is the excitement about autonomous vehicles and different types of automated safety technologies that are coming. So I'm going to introduce our panel and get everybody started. You want to do this one at a time? We'll just start with actually that end. Nat Beuse, colleague of mine. He's the Associate Administrator at NHTSA for Vehicle Research. Please welcome Nat. At NHTSA, if you're talking technology and all the really cool things that are going on, Nat's the guy to know, right? Gerdes, Dr. Gerdes is a professor of mechanical engineering at Stanford. He actually does all kinds of work on autonomous vehicles with him and his students. He is spending the year as the Chief Innovation Officer at the Department of Transportation, working with Secretary Fox. Please welcome Professor Gerdes. I don't have enough time to introduce Ron, so I will just say this is Ron Medford from Google. He is Director of Safety for their self-driving car program. And the reason I don't have enough time to introduce is because, Ron actually used to work at NHTSA and all kinds of vehicle safety arenas, as well as the Consumer Protection Safety Commission. So he's got a long history of safety in his DNA, basically. And last but not least, please welcome Bryan Reimer. And Bryan is a professor from MIT, nice long list of things, working in a lot of interesting areas, but especially focused on the human-machine interactions and interface. So what's really neat is I'm done talking. I'm going to ask some really good provocative questions. Just so you know, they all submitted stuff, but what I did was pick what are the hottest, coolest things that we'd all love to really hear about. Which is why the first question, and this is your conversation. So what I'd like to do is suggest some of these you can all answer if you want. If you have something you want to throw in, feel free to do. If you don't have it, pass, right? So let's start with this. What do each of you think is sort of the next big technical challenge for autonomous vehicles? We'll start with that and then move down the road.
Sure. So I actually really don't think it'll be a technical challenge. I think over the course of technology development, the engineers always figure out how to do things, right? You give them a box, they figure it out. I think some of the biggest challenges will be on the public perception side. I'm sure Ron will probably talk about it a little bit, but when you look at sort of public reaction, media reaction to very minor crashes that one would argue are not even truly recordable crashes in the way that we would normally get crash reports, 4 or 5 weeks of constant front page news is sort of an interesting perspective about where we are as a society. I think it also speaks to sort of why we have such a slow uptick on some of the more advanced crash avoidance technologies that the administrator mentioned. I mean, these technologies are good. They actually do work and they actually do save lives, but you have a hard time getting them at the dealership, and consumers actually think they don't need them in the first place because for so long we spent a lot of time on belts and airbags, so they understand that. They wouldn't buy a car without an airbag these days, but to say you should have an automatic emergency braking system, you get kind of this reaction like, why do I need that? That's all about the other driver. And I think that those beliefs and those feelings will need to change for us to really put the gas to the floor, so to speak, on advancing safety in a very dramatic way from where we are right now.
So I'd like to maybe just toss out a framework that I think is helpful for thinking about the technical challenges. So an automobile can encounter really an unbounded set of conditions out on the road. So if you think about any scenario you can think of, add something else to that scenario and you've got a new one, right? So if I'm thinking about going through it in urban environment and I've got a pedestrian in the crosswalk and I've got an oncoming vehicle, I'll add another pedestrian in the crosswalk or add an emergency vehicle or do this. And so there's really no limit to the number of scenarios that you can think about that the car has to handle. But ultimately there's going to be a limit to the amount of software in the car and the amount of cases that the car can be specifically designed about. So you have to generalize in some way. And I think this is kind of the fundamental technical challenge, is to say, well, yeah, most of the time, the car is encountering things that are pretty easily described and pretty routine. But if you look at the fatal accident rate of one fatality for every approximately 100 million vehicle miles traveled, and you think about how many weird things you've seen happen in a car, and none of us have driven anywhere near 100 million vehicle miles, and yet we've all seen a number of very strange cases. And so in my mind, that's kind of the fundamental technical challenge, is how do you start with this broader range of possibilities, and as an engineer have the confidence that you'll never think of all of them, but that you've thought of enough of them, that you've actually put enough into the software, you've tested enough cases to have the confidence that this is going to go out and be a safety improvement. And so in my mind, that's kind of the fundamental challenge, is how do I ultimately treat an unbounded set of conditions with a bounded set of software?
No, that's a really good one. I think that at Google, first of all, just so everyone knows kind of the distinction between what Google's doing and what the rest of the auto industry is doing at the moment, is Google has for good reason decided that we want to develop a fully self-driverless car from the very beginning. That we really believe that the transformative effects and benefits come when you are able to take out the driver and safely drive the vehicle, not relying on that 94% error rate that you see from humans. But not only does it transform the safety benefits that can be derived from it, but it also enables a whole set of people that now have the ability to have personal transportation that perhaps doesn't have it today, as people age and can no longer drive, as people are disabled and can't do it. It sort of opens up that possibility too. So that's the transformative part. But I think at Google we're thinking about what Chris said, is that you really can't think about trying to program for every scenario, right? I mean, we have this kind of famous example that we saw in Mountain View that we show everybody, where we had a lady in the middle of the street in an electric wheelchair with a broom chasing a duck. So we didn't program the car to look for that, but we programmed the car to recognize that there's kind of some dynamic action of something that you haven't classified before. This doesn't look like a car or a pedestrian or bicyclist or other traditional things, but it is moving, it's in your path, so you better stop until you're sure that you can make some headway and do it safely. And so that is kind of the philosophy, but there are a lot of corner cases, and so we think about getting the safety right is it's fundamentally like three big piers. The first pier is like the knowledge that you gain from public road driving. There's no way to really learn. I think you would accept that too, except being on the road. So we've driven now 2.5 million miles it's not 100 million miles, but it's a fairly simple, large amount. And 1.5 million of those are autonomously driving. But every mile we've driven, we actually have recorded that in our library, and we can play it over. So we actually simulate about 3 million miles every day. We play about that many miles with new software that we're testing and evaluating, and we drive about almost about 15,000 miles a week now in our car. So that's almost as much as you drive every year in your car, and we're driving that in a week. And then there's this functional safety analysis, kind of the very structured way in which you begin to look at the way the car is designed and the sensors that it has and the ways that any of those fail, and that you have to find ways to mitigate those failures and actually test to make sure the mitigations are right. And then on our test track in the central, sort of west of our 2 miles east of where we are in Mountain View, we have a test track at an old Air Force base where we actually have a team that spends a good bit of its time thinking of really weird things, or like the corner cases that we don't detect on the road, and try to fool the car into making a mistake and make sure that we're testing for those. Those 3 pillars are the fundamental pieces that we're relying on to make sure we get it right. But we still have some technical work to do, and I think where we're focused now is primarily not so much on handling all the sort of the technical parts, because we haven't perfected that. We're still working on different functionalities, but really to try to get the car to drive more like a regular human, so that we're not being so cautious that we see something, we think, oh, that could be something, we hit a little brake stab, and just momentarily we might stab the brakes because the car's reacting in a very conservative way. And so trying to get it smoothed out and drive more like you do. And I think we see that as a challenge that we're facing right now. And then Nat mentioned the consumer acceptance challenge, and I think that one, I think the notion that there is a machine driving your car rather than a person, and something you don't have any kind of experiential information from, is hard to trust something like that. It's the fear of the unknown. And so what we do see is when we get people in the car and they actually experience it, they pretty quickly trust the technology and have a very different view about what the capabilities are. So we can't put everybody in the United States in our car, but if we could, that would be a really transformative process, I'm pretty sure. But we, in the meantime, have to have people see on the road that the car is performing well. And I think, as we gradually think about deploying in the future a completely driverless car and seeing it work on the road and do well, people will then actually have some data to see that from too. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. Being the last one in line here and the only one without at least some point in life a federal email address, as Chris put it out earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Just wait.
I think you have to think about this in 2 perspectives. One, if you're coming at this perspective of full autonomy from the Google perspective of starting over, starting from the ground up, and there is one set of challenges associated with that. The other is if you're coming at this from the bottom up, from really today's ecosystem of auto engineering and the manufacturing cycles that exist today that are very incremental in nature. And I'll speak really from the bottom. That's where most of my experience comes. In that fashion, I think we need to begin to think about driver state sensing and driver monitors, that if we were talking about earlier, where we are beginning to infuse a level of automation in the vehicle that is relieving the operator of moment-to-moment control over periods of time. I think Tesla is probably the manufacturer leading the way there right now. And for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to watch some videos online or get into the driver's seat in a Tesla vehicle in autopilot, you begin to understand very rapidly how much trust you can have in these technological systems and how much overtrust that you may have at certain periods of time. Well, the technology actually is far greater potential than any of us really do suspect today. It is not fail-proof. And as we begin to trust these systems with increasing quantities, our ability to make rational decisions will erode. So that means that phone ringing on the passenger seat will get harder and harder to ignore. The fact that I'm tired, Well, it's harder to ignore. I don't have to pay attention right now. Well, you might in a little bit. So over the last umpteen numbers of years, we have spent enormous resources focused on the very, very complex process of external state sensing. And we've made incredible inroads in the development of vision, LiDAR, radar, and other forms of sensing outside the vehicle. I think we need to take the same effort and turn that around inside. Because for cohesive automation to work together, short of me having no operational responsibility, in an environment and an ecosystem of trust, we need to manage the capabilities of the operator. I think the aviation world understands the fundamentals here. There's a reason there's a co-pilot and a pilot and a cockpit. The reality is we are not going to see a co-pilot and a pilot, both of human nature, in the cockpit of a car. We need a machine to take some of that role. And I think we need to change the model of external sensing and begin to think of it as ecosystem sensing. And around that, in the need for developing trust between me and the machine, trust of the machine and me, and the development of learning algorithms there, I think we need to begin to think about trust at a much more deep level. As we all understand, it will take some steps to get to Vision Zero, as Mark talks about. We need to set up the inroads for those steps today. Automation has enormous potential to save lives, but an accident in California, Massachusetts, or anywhere else at that point may drastically slow our progress. We need to think about the steps that we can form today in the public's mind of injury prevention and regulation that lessen the impact of the certainty outcome of when there is a fatality associated with automated vehicles. And I think it's a very important bump in the road that the sooner we plan for that, the faster we will reach Mark's objective of Vision Zero.
So one of the things that many of you have already started talking about is, what it's going to take to trust these vehicles, accept them, and you started talking about that. Question Secretary Fox got just last week was, do they have to be perfect? And so if you would, in the trust realm, sort of give us a sense of, well, how perfect do they have to be? Because as soon as you say, well, they don't have to be perfect, the next question, of course, is, well, where's the bar set? Yeah. So can each of you just take a moment? Let's start with Bryan, maybe, and,
Sure.
Do they have to be perfect? And if not, how do we set the bar?
So I think as everybody's talked about prior, the edge cases are quite complex, and perfect is perhaps impossible. There will always be an edge case that we didn't predict, that we didn't think of. Unfortunately, the closer we get to perfect, the harder it is for the human to get involved in the fault tolerance stage. The less likely it is and the harder we have. So as we begin to think about trust, it's the balance of overtrust and undertrust. And how do we begin to understand that balance? We encourage those who need to trust more appropriately, and we dissuade those from overtrusting in certain situations. And as I mentioned earlier, it's state sensing there to me that is a critical co-pilot, if you would, to help begin to develop that. I also think that we need to begin to take the ecosystem and the safety culture that we've been developing and fast forward in a way that regulatory efforts don't usually think. We usually think in a reactive sense. How do we think proactively for change? Is it NTSB that is given the charter today of investigating the first automated vehicle fatality or major injury? Put it on the roadmap. It's no longer a question of who, it's a question of an authority and a scientific organization that's out there. Consumers' trust in some of these systems will go up. What other independent agencies can be brought in board, whether that's IHS, the insurance industry, perhaps consortiums of the automotive industry, Camp Driver Workload Metric Program, an interesting relationship between the government industry, to begin to understand the edge cases of AEB as they occur. How do we begin the trust of full disclosure? I think the challenge there.
So AEB, automatic emergency braking, and I'm just going to push the rest of the ones. So if it doesn't have to be perfect, how do we figure out where to set the bar?
So I'll just say first, let me just talk about overtrust, because I think it's really important. So the systems, these incremental systems, really depend to some extent for their driver either to be in the loop for driving or at the very kind of at the level 2 definition, or at the level 3 where their driver is supposed to be available if needed and to get your attention back and to get you situationally aware so you can actually have the context of driving again. We think that's really hard. And so now companies are actually building ways in which they're kind of trying to keep your attention to be available to come back in and drive, or if you're supposed to be monitoring, that you're actually being reminded that you're supposed to monitor. And so this is really kind of a very strong indication that the auto companies and others and us realize that it's a really difficult task to keep people's attention when 99% of the time the car is doing exactly what it should be. I'm making that number up, I don't know. But high levels of trust. We saw this, and this was one of the things that convinced us that the approach that we were taking, we had maybe 4 years ago, a system for the freeway that was pretty well developed, and but it was supposed to have a driver there, and you were supposed to be having your hands on the wheel and your eyes forward and prepared to take over at any minute if something went wrong. And we got about 100 Googlers in the car and gave it to them sometimes for a week, sometimes for a few days, and they loved the technology, and they wanted it. And we watched the videos of what was going on in the car, and what we saw was astonishingly frightening. And because people were putting their seat back and not paying attention, they were completely doing things that told us that it was impossible for us to kind of, on the one hand, say, look, keep your eyes on the road and your hands on the wheel, when the car is saying, and the way it's performing, that I don't need to. And so that's when we began to rethink the approach that we were taking and decided that going completely driverless makes sense. Because it's other levels. It's interesting because the level 3 that I was mentioning, which the driver's not supposed to be monitoring but available, and if they don't become available, then they have this fallback safety system where the car itself, which is what we will do if there's no driver, is to have the car pull off the road and come to a safe stop. And so they're building in that capability with a recognition already that the driver may not be available. So I think that, this kind of, over trusting it is a big problem. The other problem, of course, is Mark's question about how good does it have to be. I think that, the 3 things that you have to do to assure yourself that it's ready are the things that I mentioned before. I don't think there's a magic number that you say, okay, if I've done X, Y, and Z and I've driven so many miles, then I can be assured of it. I think it is making sure that in the environment that you're driving in, I think there are stages of complexity in the environments that you drive in that you can get more assured that you're going to do well. And in those less complex environments, you probably can deploy sooner. And I think that the idea that something like being as good as a human or better than a human, and in that kind of environment, whatever metric you're going to use to do that, it could be one of the ways to begin to think about it. But I think there's basic analyses and testing are the ways that I think you convince yourself that you're ready. And there is no kind of number today for any vehicle going on the road. The book is you meet the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, and the car is ready to go on the road, and there's no number associated with it. So this is a new idea that you have to sort of have a bar with a number on it. I think that's hard.
So I think, as Ron pointed out, if you talk about lower levels of automation, trust is a huge issue. I'm going to maybe make a provocative statement and say that if you talk about a fully automated vehicle, I think trust is a non-issue. I've been out on the racetrack. We actually have automated a car that will race around a track as fast as an expert human driver. And I've had a bunch of people in the passenger seat there who, after one lap, about 3 miles, completely relax. And they're like, well, the car's doing exactly what it did last lap. I can relax. I'm like, this is a student project, I'm there with one hand on the, on the red button, ready to take this over, realizing, we're pulling 0.9 Gs there around that turn, but people relax completely. So I really feel this is a non-issue. I haven't had a situation where anybody's actually sat in one of our vehicles as it's been automated and that anxiety has lasted more than just a few miles. I think over trust is a huge issue. I really don't think acceptance of fully automated vehicles is going to be an issue at all. As soon as it provides a useful service for somebody, given the general trust in electronics that people are having these days, I think it's just going to go really quickly. How safe is safe enough? Where do we sort of set that level? I'd like to maybe cast that in a slightly different way, because I think if we do start talking about statistics, we're going to run into problems. You know, where do we set the bar? How many lives is 16,000 okay? You know, when 32,000 is not. It's never going to be okay to the person who, you know, loses a family member. According to an automated vehicle, you can make any argument in the world and it's not going to be okay. And I also don't feel that people really understand statistics. So I don't think a statistical argument is going to be helpful regardless of where you set that bar. What I've been thinking about is can we communicate what the responsibilities are that we place on an automated vehicle in order to share the roads with it? And so could you, for instance, say that this is, maybe I should pull out my Stanford hat, so I'm not, you know, setting anything for the federal government here. But if you think about the car going down the road, could we simply say the expectation is that the car should not collide with any other road user who is following the traffic laws? So if other people are following the laws, our expectation is that there is no collision, that the vehicle is programmed to avoid that. If it has a collision with somebody who is following the traffic laws, that's a defect. You know, that is something where there's a liability associated with that. But that may not be enough if we want to go to vision zero, because somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of pedestrian fatalities, as I understand it, the pedestrian is at fault. So we probably want to say, well, automated vehicles should have a respect for human life. And we should, in fact, actually demand more of them than we demand of a human driver. That we have an expectation that they also have a responsibility to avoid accidents or avoid collisions with other road users who aren't following the rules, so long as that can be handled without anyone else being harmed. And then as you get into these weird situations and these corner cases where maybe somebody steps out in the road very late and there simply is nothing that you can do, we should have some imperative to reduce harm broadly. But I think those are the cases that we're going to have to accept. And I think that that will be an easier argument if you can say to people, hey, look, the car, in fact, met all the standards that we would place on a human driver and even went beyond. That we can actually say there was no way to avoid this situation without somebody coming to harm. Bad situations are going to have bad outcomes. And this is what happened in that case.
So this is where I get in trouble, because depending on how I answer this, I'm either walking home or it'll be a nice slip in my chair when I get back tomorrow. So I'm going to say something probably a little different than the previous three guys. So, I mean, Chris is right. If you've been in any one of an automated car, even some of the crash avoidance safety technology, it's actually really easy to get really comfortable really fast until something bad happens. The recent issues with Takata is a prime example of that. I mean, 2,500 plus people saved every year by airbags. An unfortunate defect has led to a dozen or so fatalities, less than that, over a decade. And you have people literally calling for airbags to be taken out of cars and unplugged and everything like that, which we're in the School of Public Health would be the wrong reaction to that, because we would lose many more people as a result of that kind of policy. And I think that the public can be fickle when it comes to sort of new technologies, right? I mean, it's one thing to talk about your TV or your phone or whatever that you have to reboot every day, or it seems like to get a new update or something like that happens. It's quite another thing. I was sitting on a panel with somebody about 2 months ago, and they were talking about how their car was rebooting while they were driving down the road. Now, granted, it was just the center stack for the radio, but he found that very jarring as a driver. And so I think all these things play in the public's mind, because it seems to me drivers feel like when they're driving they have ultimate control, even though at times they don't, given the circumstances. And it might be different if you're in a car that has no controls, and then maybe you just give that up until you get hit by somebody else, and then you go through this thing where I could have avoided that kind of thing, because we've also seen that happen. With regards to metric, I think it's a very excellent question, because I actually get it all the time and I still don't have a good answer to it. But I will tell you sort of some differences. On the crash side, where we spent sort of 35 years sort of perfecting crash performance of vehicles, we have a tool that we use, a test dummy. It's sensors in metal and things like that, but it tells us how a driver would feel, how a human being would feel if they were in such a collision. We don't really have that on crash avoidance. We've not spent the research dollars sort of trying to figure out what that looks like. We've spent all of our dollars sort of modeling scenarios when things go bad. So NHTSA, car companies, everybody is really good at coming up with scenarios when things go bad and coming up with a widget to fix that. Now we're talking about how do you model everyday driving, and then what is that performance level that you're looking for. So indeed, one of the things that will likely come out of it is you need some different metrics. What you've done in the past won't work. You can't just drive around on a test track. You can't just do the mother of all road tests and drive all over the United States and say, I've captured these scenes. And you can't just do computer simulation and check the box and think that you've got it all. It's going to be something different. It has to be something different because we already know what those yield. But I also say that it's not sort of looking for 100%. If you look at automatic emergency braking, a technology that is about, let's say, 5 or 6 years old in the new vehicle fleet, it still has challenges. We have a famous bridge that we joke about in New Jersey that even the most advanced vehicle system on the planet still has problems with that bridge. And it's amazing because it has every sensor to know that that bridge is there, but it still has problems on that bridge. But does that mean we don't pursue that technology or we don't encourage people to put it out there? Absolutely not. I mean, it's having benefits even with those flaws. Likely, I think on the self-driving side, it will come in various different flavors, whether it's a low speed, high speed, some combination of all of those. We'll have to figure out what those operating environments are and understand that things will happen, especially given the long transition time. I was joking over lunch, unless someone comes with some innovative program where we all get new cars tomorrow, there's 265 million vehicles to replace if we're all going to have self-driving. So that transition time, it's not just going to be about the automated vehicle being able to avoid a crash by itself. It's also being able to avoid crashes with other vehicles. So it's a very challenging question to say what is 100% or what is good enough to get on the road, because it has to encompass both what that vehicle can do by itself, but also how it interacts with other vehicles on the roadway for a very long time.
And Nat, you know what that automatic emergency braking system, that problem that it had with the bridge, but explain that so people know why that's such a metaphor.
So basically the way the technology works is it looks for something in front of you. So Ron gave the example of the lady in the wheelchair, right? So think of the same thing, looks for, oh, someone's in front of me, I'm going to slam on the brakes. Well, this certain vehicle, and actually it's not just one manufacturer, there's kind of a lip on the bridge where there's a little metal guard kind of thing there that happens. And so the vehicle thinks that there's something in the roadway. Smart engineer designed it, stop for something in the roadway. Well, that little bit of difference actually caused the vehicle to actually almost go into a full braking event in the middle of traffic. So a very dangerous scenario on one hand, but one that you could have driven maybe on the other side of the country and you would have never seen a bridge abutment like that, except in New Jersey. It's not picking on New Jersey, by the way.
So just to be clear, we're at the second question. It's already getting really interesting, right? And just to be clear, this is open, so there could even be press here. So anyway,
doing, Jeff?
If you want to put that hat on at appropriate times, feel free. The question everybody loves to ask is timing. When is this available? Part of it depends on what question you ask, right? So ask whatever question you want about timing and go ahead and answer it. Let's start with you, Nat.
Timing of when? Timing when I can get in the backseat of my car and get to work, or?
And that's the whole thing about the question, right?
Yeah.
Timing when it could be on the road, timing when everyone's going to drive one, timing when it's really based on the question. So you ask the timing question and answer it.
Sure, yeah. So I think it's not a per se year, because I think we will see multiple different operational characteristics. I think for as much grief as we all like to give the quote-unquote traditional manufacturers, they will have versions of automation that might have very limited operating scenarios, let's say low-speed traffic or even on a freeway, but they will expect you to get back in the loop at some point. Well, that's a form of automation that might allow me to tune out every now and then, depending on the system. Certainly what Google's developing, which is sort of no controls, could also happen kind of in that same time frame. Does that mean no controls to go from here to Florida? I think Ron would probably say probably not. But I think that it does mean, as a society and as government, we have to be responsible for all of that. And I think that's sort of the challenge that we're under from the Secretary, to sort of produce these operational guidelines that will encompass sort of all those different pockets. Because one thing we haven't talked much about, and it's worthwhile talking about, is kind of the heavy truck side of the equation, where there could be huge gains of efficiency in terms of even simple, I'll call it simple in quotes, automation, platooning, where maybe you have a lead driver and then you have another driver in the back, or maybe you don't, and the vehicle is just following the other vehicle, simple path following. one that Chris and I were joking about just last week is sort of the automated delivery thing. Well, that's still a motor vehicle that NHTSA would be responsible for, but it might never ever have a driver in it. How is that vehicle going to interact in the roadway? And that could happen probably a lot sooner than worrying about sort of somebody in the back seat and all this other kind of stuff. So I think it'll happen sooner than we think.
I'll maybe raise that up a slight notch to say that automated vehicles are already here. And so it really is just a question of how structured the environment is. So there are automated mine vehicles. If you go to many airports, you're going to be in an automated vehicle going from one terminal to the other. And these are much more structured environments than you'll see in general on the roadways. And so it's really just a question of, okay, how much structure do you need? If you reduce the speed, that makes the problem easier. You don't have to see as far around. It's easier to remove the speed from the vehicle and therefore remove the severity of a collision. And so you see a lot of these low-speed demonstrations, some of the city mobile vehicles in Europe and other sort of deployments of this last-mile transportation options. And so I think it's here today, and you're just going to see increasing uses of low-speed full automation that's going to come closer and closer into contact with our daily lives. Actually, people ask me that about, when I'm in California, when will we see automated vehicles on the road? And I said, well, walk 2 blocks down from our house, and that's actually the street on which Google's facility lies, and you can see them driving around all the time. So I think really the technology is here. It really just is a chance of finding the structured environment for the first deployments, and I think it'll spread out from that rapidly.
Yeah, I think you asked a really good question, because a lot of people get confused about what it means to have driverless cars on the road, and I think that there are autonomous cars on the road, and Chris gave a great answer. They're here today, but I think that in our case with Google, first that we would say it's not coming until we're confident about its safety, and what, okay, then when are you going to be confident about your safety? We think relatively soon, but we don't have a date to put on it. So so it's in, and I think it will be a modest way of deploying in an environment that we feel very good good about in terms of its safety performance, and so this is going to be this gradual rollout of introducing the technology in that form. I think it's not going to be replacing the 265 million vehicles that are on the road today, which I think, like most people think, well, when am I going to have access to it, right? That's kind of when you think, well, and I think it depends on where you are and where we are, whether you have access to our vehicle. But I think over time it will roll out, and I think, as Chris mentioned, which I agree with, that acceptance will come faster than many people might believe today. But I think until it's available in this kind of full form and the kind of the levels in which you can truly not pay attention, those are the levels of autonomy that we're talking about primarily, that are being regulated by California, for example. And I think that, there's a lot of nervousness about it. I think that the government's very understandably always kind of risk averse and nervous about, if something happens, I'm going to get blamed. I'm going to be called on the carpet. And I think we need an understanding that I've been saying this ever since I've been at Google, that there will be autonomous vehicle crashes. Perfection is not realistic. And so what's realistic is that the car should be performing extremely well. They'll do things that humans, in terms of safety prevention and collision prevention, that humans won't do generally. And there's big numbers around drunk driving. 25% of all deaths come from drunk driving. Speed is a major contributor to that. We won't speed. Distracted driving, all that, drowsy driving, all those things that are big behavioral hits on fatalities. You don't have those, and I think that's a big savings in the bank at the very beginning. So I think they'll come soon, but not until we're confident that they're safe.
So I'm the human factors guy here, so technology, that's a whole nother story here. But I do think one has to remember that the basics of automated vehicles are on the roads today. and it is more of how quickly the fleet will begin to change towards one that includes increasing levels of fully automated vehicles. Is it exponential? Is it linear? Who knows at this point? But it's clear that we are on that slope, and that slope will be increasing at some function.
So, really hot topic right now that everybody's concerned about is cybersecurity. Everywhere. But now there's a focus on vehicles. So let's do some questions here where one can answer, all of you can answer, but I'll just sort of toss it to the crowd. So what about cybersecurity and its role in both protecting the future, but also creating a vulnerability? So anyone who wants to start, Chris.
All right, well, the interesting thing is we've done a lot of research with production vehicles, and the reason that we've been successful with production vehicles is that we can tap into existing systems and make them do other things. So if you think about it, all this research that we've published, I mean, we kind of are the hackers in some sense. We like to think that we wear the white hats, or at least the Stanford Cardinal hats, but we have actually tapped into vehicle systems. And so that's one of the nice things. I've been working with automated vehicles since 1992 when I started doing my PhD work in this. And then you had to strap on things that would pull on throttle cables and push on brake pedals and do all of these sorts of dramatic things to get the vehicle to drive by itself. Nowadays, it's just simply a matter of sending the right software command to the throttle, brakes, and steering. And so that's a huge benefit to developers, but on the other hand, you need to make sure that you know what is sending those throttle, brake, and steering commands. And I think that the one thing about the car being such a complex system and being put together, a lot of the vulnerabilities that have been found to date, and you can correct me if I'm off on this, but have come through things such as the entertainment systems in the cars. When they start to make connections across networks in the cars, you're only as secure as your least vulnerable component. And I think that's where things do need to be thought of very carefully. For a while, it was like, hey, this is great. We've got a network. Let's put everything on the network, and then everything can talk to each other. And that's a benefit until you realize that also gives the opportunity for things to talk to each other that shouldn't be. And to be separated. And so I think you see a growing awareness of this in the auto industry, but this is clearly something that needs to be addressed, not only with just traditional automotive functional safety, I think, but with the best standards of cybersecurity that you see in the software industry. And there's some very good references and resources for that, but those may not be the sorts of things that auto manufacturers have been traditionally focused on, ways that you can sort of design code to thwart deliberate attacks hasn't really been the focus of most, say, engine control system design and things in the past. And so it's important to kind of pull those tools there. But I think there are a lot of good tools available for that.
I think this goes back to trust at the fundamentals. Cybersecurity for today's automotive industry is a very, very difficult problem. The vehicle is a legacy device, complex in nature, of extraordinary fashions, but it is really bolting together subsystems that are independently engineered, not secure, and our ability to tap into that, whether that is through connected networks that someone decides to open up a port, or the worst case scenario, someone decides to plug into a wire somewhere in your vehicle, are immense. I think that really taking a step back and beginning to think at the OEM level today, not only at the Google level, of how do you really move these systems, scary port, over a 10, 20, or 30-year vision from where they are today towards one that promotes cohesive cybersecurity. It can't happen overnight. None of today's legacy manufacturers can move their products into really a secure framework overnight. The supplier network doesn't exist. I, for one, was relatively shocked when we started to do a considerable amount of work in Teslas and realizing, given that how much they are, an advanced vehicle, technology-driven manufacturer, but they're relying on the legacy suppliers, which means at the end of the day, they're as open and vulnerable as everybody else because the parts aren't there to go any other way.
So I would say that we certainly take at Google take it seriously, and dealing with cyber attacks is something the company deals with every day, and has a fleet of security experts that are available to us, and the team uses that resource and has used them a few times now at looking at our current systems that are in that current little pod vehicle, a small vehicle that has low speed, and actually doing some challenging testing on it to make sure that we're providing adequate testing. And that's something that's kind of dynamic. The idea that you would publish a standard and think that you've got it covered is really, it can't work, right? Because every day something new that comes up that has to be protected against that you didn't think about or hadn't been understood. So whatever happens in terms of trying to provide some at least floor level guidance about ensuring that companies provide the type of design and structure for cyber attacks has to be a living document and has to be updated, and practices of companies are going to far exceed, if they're doing their job, are going to far exceed whatever practices or standards are written. I don't know that there really is enough known today to write, quote, standards, but I think technical guidance that is able to be updated and reflecting on what's going on in the cyber world regularly is probably the right approach.
So maybe less folks walk out of here thinking that their car is going to get hacked tomorrow. Much like Chris's folks, my guys have been, quote unquote, hacking into vehicles for a long time, but we didn't call it that for much the same reasons that he was doing it for, so we could put vehicles into maneuvers to figure out if certain technologies were actually functioning or not. I think that we've been on this for a while. I think we weren't putting out bulletins and all that kind of stuff that just happened this week, but for a while we've been talking about cybersecurity with the automakers, recognizing all the issues with legacy vehicles and things like that. And I would actually postulate that even smaller manufacturers are in the same boat as the legacy guys in terms of being able to implement architectural changes any quicker than the next guy. And cyber is different. It can't be treated like safety has been treated, that's for sure. At least that's what I would put on the table. It can't be this sort of traditional safety posture where we see, okay, is this really a defect or not? It's like, no, you got to go fix it, and then you figure out later what you're going to do with it. And some of these things aren't fixable overnight. I mean, if you look at the Jeep issue that was last summer, that was sort of resolved by an over-the-air update through the network, on the network side of things, not even on the vehicle side of things, to close a port on the actual vehicle. So there is a lot to be said about sort of where the industry is and where it's going, but there's also a lot to be said about, there's a whole lot of lessons learned that can already be readily applied to vehicles, so it's not like folks are having to start from scratch. I would say one of the things, since we're in a school environment, university environment, one of the things that is a very real concern, both from a federal government standpoint and an industry standpoint, is being able to get students interested in this field. Ron probably has no problem because they all go work on the Google IT side of things, but I doubt it was to work on the vehicle side of things. One person joked to me not too recently, if you can spell cyber these days on a resume, you're sort of a hot commodity in Detroit, which is not the way anybody wants to do anything. It's just a recognition that the engineering schools, the university system really has to put sort of a new focus on this area for the vehicle environment, where it frankly hasn't existed before now. Most of the conversation has been all about IT infrastructure, which is different than the vehicle environment, because one of the things we have to balance is the whole being able to repair a vehicle and how do you lock things down and things like that. So there's lots of discussions going on and lots of debate going on about how to do that in a way that still allows a driver to be able to take their car to any mechanic they want to and get that vehicle repaired while still having the vehicle be secured from unwanted accesses from Chris's guys and my guys, but also the guys that want to do bad things. So it is an evolving space, and it's one that sort of a level of an alertness is needed and a level of continuing to push forward. And I think this administration in particular has been very forward-leaning on cybersecurity, getting the companies to do a lot of different things, one of which is sort of impress on people the idea that cybersecurity needs to be treated at the highest levels of the company, which is really different from kind of how long it took us to get safety at that level. I think probably the administrator would argue we might be there just now. I don't know. But cybersecurity, we're already there where they've fully recognized that they've got to get this right, because one thing that is very real is an attack to any one manufacturer, big, small, or indifferent, has a dramatic effect across the entire vehicle fleet. So I think this is one where they have kind of recognized that and see a shared responsibility to get it right and move in the right direction as fast as possible.
I think you made a great point just about the education role as well, because as we've talked about, as I've taught designing control systems, a lot of times you teach, okay, well, how do you know that that sensor data is good? And there's a lot of checks on that, and in fact, there's a lot of checks of that on production vehicles. So sometimes when we were trying to get the vehicle to steer itself, it would just refuse our command. That's not really great when you're out on a racetrack and it decides it's going to default to just basically straight ahead. But this is something that we had to work through, and there are those sorts of checks and balances. But there are different checks to sort of say, all right, let me design this so that regardless of whatever hostile action somebody might take, whatever signal they may send me in on this sensor through a network, I'm able to react to that and treat it appropriately. And I think that, it's a great thing that really could be brought up in class examples and have people sensitized to that.
Yeah.
So Nat, you alluded to the, just for a moment, if you will, the Jeep, but would you just give one moment of what actually happened in that particular incident?
Sure. So that was a case where some researchers had figured out a flaw in a head unit, which is the infotainment side of that particular vehicle. And the head unit manufacturer was Reimer, who was in many vehicles. This is not anything that's top secret. And that particular implementation on that particular platform is what created the vulnerability, which is interesting when you think about it. So in one hand, other vehicles were fine, but on the other hand, this one particular make and model, the way it was implemented, was the one that created a vulnerability. And it was an interesting vulnerability in the sense that it was the first one that was really demonstrated to be able to do it from far away, so sort of a attack en masse kind of scenario versus having physical access, which is what all the other research that had been done had all been about physical access, which the way the vehicles are designed, they are meant for that, right? They're meant to have access to the CAN bus so you can do diagnostics and other things. And in fact, that's how they do a lot of diagnosing problems. So in that particular case with the Jeep, they were able to open those ports and get into on the CAN bus and start activating ABS brakes and other things like that. The particular challenge in there was the fact that the researchers were going to kind of publish the book how to do it. And so there was a lot of work done to figure out how to close the vulnerability and all that kind of stuff before all that happened.
So we are at a distinguished research university.
Yes.
Get out your pens and paper. Could each of you highlight what you think are the top 3 research issues that would really advance autonomous vehicles? And Ron, I can see you're looking for your pen, but I'm thinking, let's go with the operational guy first, or should I wait?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Go to this.
Well, we started with him last time, but what would you identify as like the top 3 research issues that will really push forward autonomous vehicles? So you're looking, why don't you go ahead and we'll just come down the row.
So one of the things that Ron mentioned was sort of the testing of the edge cases. I've often used the vernacular, the bookends. So traditionally we look at the bookends and then come up with tests on the bookends and say, if you can meet those tests on the bookends, then you're probably pretty sure you're going to do everything in the middle reasonably okay. Well, there are a few scenarios where that theory doesn't actually work too well. So one of the challenges we will have going forward is actually developing what is that suite of tests. So I mentioned that it's not just going to be you did some maneuver on the test track, yep, did that pass, you drove 500 miles in some differences of climates and terrains and different bridge abutments and blah blah blah, check, passed that, and I did a giant Monte Carlo analysis and figured out the 25 bazillion scenarios around one particular, yep, did that, check, ready to go. I think it's going to be more than just those 3 things, because those are what we do now, as I mentioned. So it's going to have to be some sort of perhaps weighting of each one of those, or it's going to have to be some new methodology even in general, where maybe you start doing more hardware in the loop kind of scenarios where you just have the sort of the brains, let's call it, sitting on a table and you just pepper it with a whole bunch of different things. But I think one of the things that we've seen already is sort of the rule of unintended consequences. So if you introduce a change on one side of the equation, how do you reasonably be sure that you didn't create yet another situation somewhere else in the system? So I think that body of research is still ongoing. I mean, we're doing the very beginnings of it, which is looking at operational characteristics. So if you're in a low-speed environment, how do you know you're in a low-speed environment? How do you stay in that low-speed environment? That kind of scenario. But then beyond that, it's going to be how do you actually really run down some tests to say, yep, I know what I'm doing there. I think the other thing I would probably say is, and it's related to that, is sort of the idea of fail-safe and functional safety. That's an area where, you know, there's not been a lot of work in terms of how do you fail safe and what that really means. Does that mean you pull yourself over to the side of the road and that's fail safe, or does it mean you go into a limp home mode and that's fail safe, or is it some combination of the two depending on what environment you're in? I think that's in a body of work that still has yet to be done.
I'm going to give a research area, but I also want to give an observation. So just seeing this from the other side now on the government side, and working with the Secretary on some of his desires for innovation, I'm also realizing how wonderful the freedom that you have at a university is for choosing research problems. And so when you look at even what drives funding agencies, or the process that goes into setting research directions within the government or within industry, most of my research at Stanford has been industry supported, what small companies can do. None of these organizations really have the ability to sort of take a broad look easily at what people are not doing and move in a very agile fashion into that direction. So I guess one of the things that I would encourage from the university side is that is really valuable. And I guess I've kind of known it's valuable, but working in the last month, this is really valuable. And so I would encourage everybody to kind of move in an area where they're passionate about and try to fill the gaps, do the problems that nobody else is working on, because that's a way, I think, of really being very forward-looking and having thought leadership in the field. I do think there are some great research questions left with this, and one that I haven't heard too much discussion about that I'm trying to get people to think about is to think about who benefits from this technology. And it's very easy to think of, I think there's plenty of market opportunities to bring people from the wealthy suburbs to the business district in an automated fashion. You ought to hear about, hey, that's great, I can spend my commute working. That assumes that you are in a job that you can actually do in a car, which doesn't necessarily apply to everyone in this country. And if you start to think about some of the advantages of point-to-point mobility, we talked about shipping goods. Are we talking about expediting overnight Amazon purchases, or are we talking about bringing food into food deserts in the city where there are no supermarkets? Are we thinking about bringing wireless internet and maybe even classrooms so kids who maybe don't have the greatest environment at home to study at night have a place to go and to work on their classwork? With approximately 42% of taxi rides taken by people with household incomes of $20,000 or less, can this point-to-point mobility really reduce income segregation in the U.S.? So I think this is a great opportunity for some people to think deeply about where are the benefits of this technology, and can some of these initial deployments be maybe in very inobvious places that can really bring a lot of good to people. So that's something I'd love to encourage people to think about.
So I have a couple of that are similar. So the one is the idea of not having a driver gives you complete freedom to redesign the interior of the car. And so what should that design look like? You take out the steering wheel, the brake pedal, and the accelerator pedal, and all of a sudden you can redesign the car in a way that you've never had the freedom to think about in the past. And so I think one really important area of research is, what does that new design interior look like? And how much freedom do you have in the confines of kind of the regulatory restrictions that may exist in terms of certain layout requirements that are in regulations today? But I do think that's a really important one. The second one was really one that you mentioned, Chris, which is, what do people want to do with a car like this that has no driver? I mean, it has lots of potential uses and applications, but understanding those deeply can really help our company figure out, what is it that you're going to do for society that is a real benefit. And I think that's information that needs a lot of research on in terms of what are the applications for the technology and how does that really fit into the design of the vehicle. And so those two things kind of go together. And so, and then I'll do one on a technical challenge, which everyone knows, or many people know, that we currently haven't developed the ability for the car to drive in snow or in really heavy rain or on icy roads. And so, and I think much like humans, this is not an easy environment to drive in. So on the snow, there's a particular challenge because we develop our own very detailed maps for self-driving vehicles, and the world changes when it gets snowed on. It looks different, and so the car doesn't know where it is. And so we began to now think and consider the issue about how do we handle the snow problem. So those are kind of three things that I thought of.
I think we need to take a very deep look at demand modeling, as has been reflected here in how we're going to move about. The current forecasts say, okay, if you give mobility to everybody, we will move more. Well, how much more? Does the infrastructure that exists today really support the amount of movement? If personalized autonomous vehicles are going to become a part of the norm, and my family is going to own one, that's going to have a big impact on the demand mobility part. It'll bring me to work, go get my wife, take the kids to school. Now you have empty vehicles moving all over the place. So I think we got to get a really good grasp on what that demand picture looks like. Obviously, cars will move closer together, accidents will be lower, but take 250 round number million vehicles, and you put them all, 65 million vehicles, and you put them all moving in different ways. There's a lot of things that are going to change. I think we need to take a deep look at the liability structure that exists in this country, and I think the liability structure is an area that needs to be changed before many of these self-driving features are really going to become market realities. It's going to be very difficult in nature. How do we change that is a very open research question. Lastly, I think we need to look at the question of, do we take this incremental change that we've talked about, where you keep feature by feature allowing automation to creep up, or do you really need to come over the top, as Google has talked about? And I don't think that's an easy decision we can make today. But if we as humans are going to remain a critical component here, we have an ecosystem of support that needs to be developed. And that ecosystem of support is an incredibly difficult area to develop. But we think we need to step back for a moment, perhaps it's a few years, because it is that complex, and begin to ask the question, can we come at this from both sides? Or does the Google's decision that was made 4 years ago, as Ron talks about it, saying, look, we got to start from the ground up, the only rational one? Or do we say, oh, well, we're going to have a driver in here, we need to come up with the personas of what we're going to have? See if we can start to chart some of that strategy. And it comes partly from an injury prevention perspective. Cars moving at 25 miles an hour have a lot less injury perspective than things moving at 75, 80. Is the regulatory environment going to move to support which or the other, and what environments? So there's a lot of pictures that I think need to be pointed together in that ecosystem.
Great. So we actually are going to slide into question and answer, right? Can I just... Great. So we have about 25 minutes. And as a heads up, we're going to actually finish this when I come back. And each of you, shorter is harder. Everybody's used to me saying this. Give me the 1 page, not the 20-page paper. Right? The 10-minute presentation, not the hour. At the end, one line from each of you about whatever you'd like. What we haven't discussed, the last thought you want everyone to leave the room with. But when we're done with the Q&A, we'll just go down the line and let each of you have sort of one line so we wrap it up. Anyway, we have time for Q&A, so let's start here and then we'll go back there. Oh, I'm sorry. See, if you have the microphone, you get the next one.
I was going to stop.
And it would be helpful, just give us name and where you're from here at Hopkins so we know who we're talking to.
Koos Hamburger. I was a friend of Danny Raskin, and my interest is in trauma. This was a fascinating lecture, and I look forward to seeing where all this is going. To sort of tie into the last comment that was made, I have found something very interesting. I have a relatively new car. My wife does not. And so I have come to rely very quickly on the technology my new car offers, which tells me when there's a car next to me and I have to be careful with changing the lanes, and the car automatically maintains the distance between my own car and cruise control and the car in front of me. And that's wonderful. And then I drive my wife's car, and you see where this is going.
Yep.
So she yells at me and says, "What are you doing? You're getting too close to the car," and I'm relying on the car to stay away from it, and clearly it doesn't do that. So the human factor component of this, how do you work this retrograde when we get used to these new technologies and they don't present themselves? Thank you.
I'll take it one step further. You're in one vehicle model A and it performs in one way, and you're in vehicle model B and they're both brand new, and the cross-training problem is immense. It is a problem and it is a challenge, and that's why I asked the question, can you come from the bottom up? But we do live in the U.S., on the other hand, where although Administrator Rosekind probably could come up with some crafty authoritative language to talk about taking classic cars off the road, I don't see that happening so quickly. So the reality is there's nothing we're going to do about that, except we are fundamentally going to need to revisit the driver education side that we have not talked about today. The broader question is, does it have to be experiential in nature, or can it provide elements of online book education we're coming used to? And that's a really open question. So perhaps there are new warning indicators in the car that are needed. Perhaps there are some new standards in how those need to be displayed. And perhaps they were needed yesterday. Because when you do sit in a car with ACC and you begin to trust that system very quickly, and you fall back, it can get scary in a real hurry.
Let's be careful not to drag classic cars into this, though. I don't actually own a car with an automatic transmission, and so I use my right hand, and it keeps me from texting, keeps me focused on driving.
So ACC, adaptive cruise control, which is what you're exactly describing. Any other comments or nope?
But no, the only thing I was going to add is, I mean, it is true that probably the engineering, the science research part of it was not as mature as it is now on the human factors side. I mean, we were actually talking about this yesterday, matter of fact, when we were meeting with the administrator on something else. So there are things coming in the works to kind of help start to address that problem, but at some point, the toothpaste already came out of the tube a little bit, and so now it's going to be a game of catch-up. But I think there are examples, not just in the automotive space, but generally speaking, about how sometimes good engineering ideas don't end up resulting in kind of good human factors choices.
And just
I think one of the cohesive pieces that I've been arguing for some time, and this is a good illustration of it, but it's broader. We need to develop the data infrastructure to understand how bad these problems are in some situations. Right. We know that ACC and cruise control trade-offs are difficult. Is that the monumental one that needs limited resources, or are there others? So how do we begin to develop the ecosystem of data to support this technology evolution that doesn't exist today?
And I was just going to welcome to NHTSA's world, which is as soon as you say, well, one of the ways to handle that consistency is to have a regulation or best practice or guideline, and in the next sentence somebody screams, that blocks innovation, right? We want to have all those different things with that, and that's the challenge, right, is to kind of thread that needle. So just got him a microphone.
Stan Becker, Population Department. My impression has been that the Japanese have been ahead of the U.S. in robotics, at least. How is their approach, or the approach of the Europeans, on this automatic vehicles different from what Google or the automakers are doing here? Thank you.
Good question.
So, I mean, I'll just say what they say, right? And which is what I read. So I haven't talked to them in depth about this. Maybe Chris or Nat have, but I think the Japanese generally seem. I would say that, the idea of taking the driver completely out of the driving task is something they're coming slowly to, but it's not that much different than the American car companies either. I think that the American car companies are sort of saying the same thing. I think it is this kind of Google approach to no driver that seems to be the big, somewhat big divide. But I do think that you see the Europeans and the Japanese and the Americans all sort of now committed to, different than it was 3 years ago or 3.5 years ago when I went to Google, that they really believe in autonomy now, in this matter of how do you introduce it, and how do you get customers used to it? And I think that's happening really on all fronts. Full autonomy is something that I think the Japanese and others are not bought into quite yet. I mean, I think they see it as a part of their long-term strategy. It's just not a part of their immediate shorter-term strategy like it is for us.
You know, we've worked with from my Stanford position with auto manufacturers in all these different countries, and I would say I think some of the German auto manufacturers have been a little bit more aggressive in terms of introducing some of the advanced systems to market. Interestingly enough, the Japanese auto manufacturers view the U.S. as the first target market for automation. Nissan has come out and said that specifically. So it is kind of interesting that while you have a lot of robotics in Japan, the Japanese auto manufacturers talk about first deployments in the U.S.
I think something else others need to realize is Toyota formed a research institute, TRI, over the last 6 months, put $1 billion over 5 years, split between basically Silicon Valley and Cambridge, Massachusetts, to focus on, in theory, level 2, level 3 automation. I think that's an interesting question of, okay, where has Japan been if they're spending that much now? But clearly put the stake in the ground where they see the future.
She had a question. Should we get?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Probably my voice is probably loud.
And I'll repeat. Go ahead.
Pam here with Cambridge Systematics. And I really wanted to get back to the question on the driver or the person in the vehicle. And have we even thought about how we're going to educate or train all of the people that are going to be using those vehicles? You have new drivers, and then you have people like myself who've been driving for a long time and, are going to freak out when something, automated happens. Are we looking at establishing training facilities where somebody can go and get in a vehicle, a driverless vehicle, and try it out? What about licensing? I mean, are we going to have a special license that says, yes, we know how to drive this kind of vehicle?
So, moderator prerogative, I'm going to distill that down to really 2 quick, easy, straightforward, no sweat, right? So what about driver education, which hasn't really been addressed in the United States forever? And the other is how this affects licensing. How do those 2 issues sort of factor into this?
So in terms of driver education, we haven't faced that in any real way in terms of cruise control, let alone assistive cruise control. So I think we do need to take a step back. We've needed to take that step back for 20 years or more now towards a vision of lifelong driver education. And the broader question is can we tie that to licensure? Obviously, there's 50 states involved. Can that be textbook based? Does that have to be experiential based? Costs money, takes time, would have more resistance to it. But I don't think we can look at the automation space as the real need there. I think it's a need from today, and it's in desperate need of in investment, both from perhaps federal oversight, federal guidance, but it's in essence a state issue at the end of the day, as it would have to be tied to licensure. I think when you come to licensure and you come to some frame, we'll use the word graduated licensing, we were using that earlier, of graduated licensing when it applies to various levels of automation, I think there's going to have to be something there, because one of the things we know about automation is as the level of automation increases, more expertise and more training is going to be required to know how to functionally operate that, which means that we are going to need longitudinally, not tomorrow or today, some change in licensure standards throughout the U.S., if not the industrialized world.
Anyone else?
I mean, so it's a tough issue. I think the only thing I would add is part of what we're doing with our state policy guidance is to talk about that at a more fundamental level with the states about sort of the difference between where we are today versus where we're going, and how to treat the whole driver licensing issue and driver training. But I dare to embarrass anybody in here, but I'm sure the first time anybody opened up their owner's manual was when some little light came on in the car and you went to go look up what it was. And so I would also wager a guess that I suspect anybody who's bought a car recently, like the last thing you want to do is actually listen to the salesman explain to you all the features, given the reality that he actually doesn't know half the time what he's talking about. But I think those are two fundamental issues that as drivers in the U.S. we actually have to come to terms with, which is you have a responsibility that you're driving this 3,000 plus pound vehicle with certain features on it, and you probably need to learn how to use it appropriately. And it's more than just getting in and finding where the key is. I mean, those things are things that we have to wrestle with as a nation, not just at a research level. It's really a national issue about what to do about driver training as vehicles become more advanced. Even if we assume we leapfrog and we get to where Google is, where we have vehicles with no controls, this will continue to be an issue for some time, including the licensing. I mean, we were talking at lunch about sort of what to do about licensing of older drivers, which is a very hot topic within the agency as well. Jeff Michael, my colleague over there, and I kind of spearheaded sort of an older occupant plan that has all sorts of behavioral components and vehicle components. And one of those components is actually using crash avoidance technologies to help older drivers be better drivers in some ways, but obviously gotta know how to use it and what it's doing. So very, very real pertinent issue that you raised.
I like to look at, if you have a disruptive technology, how do you use it to solve the problem of its own disruption? And so I would say with all the intelligence and computers going into cars, maybe that's where the training should be, as opposed to simply having state DOTs and DMVs try to figure out, okay, what are the manufacturers introducing, what should the training be, and how do we roll this out? Can you just take the technological advance that's causing you the problem and make it the solution?
Yeah. I would also argue that the higher the level of automation, the less training is needed, right? So that, I think there's lower and lower level training needs for the higher automation, quite frankly.
Yeah. Until that light comes on.
Then the car pulls over. Right?
Oh, I'm sorry. He has a mic. Let's get him the next one so he can be next. Go ahead. Sorry.
Peter Moe with the Maryland Motor Vehicle Administration. So I've been carefully taking my notes. And like you, we're trying to envision all of the possible futures. Maryland is, I think, the only state that requires all new drivers, regardless of age, to go through driver ed. But we still have the same classic challenges. And so as a part of this, looking at the new technology, we have to look at the opportunities as much as the fears. So looking at all the ways in which the technology can benefit us, and driver ed is one of those. And we know we are going to continue to have those customers of ours that will have problems in whatever system is designed. So licensing, education, all those kinds of things, they're going to present us some unique challenges. So when you're done the model state policy, give us a call.
So we didn't ask for that, but thank you, because one of the things is the President Volvo actually came to the United States and talked about how Europe's kind of goofed this up already. It's a patchwork in the countries over there, and acknowledged, there was a question earlier, where are we internationally? Basically said the United States is in the lead, stay in the lead, don't create a patchwork. So that's one of the reasons we're working on that, is because clearly that was a gap area, the deployment guidance and that area, basically, that you're not going to see these out effectively unless you can address that in some way. Good, plenty of time. There you go with your mic.
My name is Kavi Bhala. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of International Health. Road safety is my primary area of focus, yet every time I hear about autonomous vehicles, including the conversation today, it just seems completely difficult to understand where the world is headed. Sort of like autonomous technology coming on its own and my not having any control. So let me ask you the question that would make this much clearer for me. Can you name 5 technologies that are currently available, that could be deployed in current cars, that then I can then turn to NHTSA and say, please require these to be in cars next year or in the next 5 years?
So let's tell a really good story about that. Go ahead, Matt.
I assume I did not pay him to ask that question either.
But I think it's a great, because you could use those other examples previously.
Sure. So I think the fundamental one is automatic emergency braking. Even when you look at a fully automated vehicle, if you can't stop the car for a pedestrian, cyclist, other car, not sure what you're doing. So I think that is one that we are very bullish on. And in fact, we just recently announced last week that we got 20 automakers to agree to put that particular technology on as standard equipment without a regulation. There was a lot of work on the back end all last fall to do that, but they got there. I think it's in recognition of the fact that it is an important fundamental building block for where we are. The other one I'll mention, totally gratuitous, is vehicle-to-vehicle communications, and that's one where we are pushing for regulation because of many factors, two of which are you need economies of scale, right? You got to have another vehicle to talk to for it to actually have any benefits. And then the other thing is it's sort of a game changer in terms of crash avoidance technologies. It is the one technology that could actually be retrofitted on older vehicles. Automatic emergency braking cannot, but V2V could. Just even showing up can have benefits. So rather than going through four, I'll give you those two because I think they are kind of just the two fundamental building blocks for when you look down the road and you say, what does a fully connected and automated efficient transportation system look like? It looks like vehicles that can go on their own, keep their occupants safe, and communicate with older vehicles and communicate with each other to make the system more efficient so that I can pull up maybe on my watch at that point, or maybe I'll have an implant or something. All right, I'm going to the bus stop, and some last mile vehicle comes and picks me up, takes me to the train, whatever that route is, all done very efficiently through a big communication network.
And I'm going to step into this one for a minute because I think, let's go back to the opening context we talked about, 32,675. And if this year we're going up almost 10%, we got to do something different, right? And that's why the context isn't so much what NHTSA can do or what an auto manufacturer, it's what everybody can do to bring that safety faster to our roadways, right? So whether that's human behavior, everybody wear your seatbelt from now on, okay, or new technology, we got to figure out ways to do that. And part of my pause is because Nat was critical to the announcement last week. Those 20 manufacturers represent 99.6% of all new car vehicles, which means they're going to bring this out in 6 years, by 2022, standard on all vehicles, 2025 for SUVs and all the heavy, okay. Just yesterday, Toyota came out with an announcement. They're going to beat it. They're going to have their entire vehicle line by 2017. Okay, hang on. Hang on. The other part is that if we did this, and again, that's sort of, we short-circuit some of this, but if you look at the last three big technologies that were regulated, okay, they would, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so they would start with rear visibility cameras, electronic stability control, and advanced airbags. And if you look, it took about 8 years plus for the rear vis camera, and it took about 10 years plus for advanced airbags. Okay, so you can wait that long, or you can figure out new tools. And that's the point, which is if there's something that needs to get done, like V2V, which is the only way to guarantee everyone's going to get that, then sometimes that's where a rule's appropriate. I think part of, and what I keep pushing, frankly, in my tenure here is we need to look at everything as quick as we can, safely, right? But that's going to get this out. And I think that's what's really interesting. At the announcement last Thursday, it's like, oh, it's 2022. Toyota's already out and said, we're going to beat that by 2017. Let me check the year. It's 2016. And that's the point. Everybody's saying is, you know what? This is competitive now. Yeah. Everyone wants to beat it. And by the way, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, the National Safety Council, and Consumer Reports, as well as NHTSA, are basically watching the agreement every year. Okay? I say that because we've not given anything up. So these are usually done when there's 20% penetration.
Or
there's
higher.
Or higher before you even start that. There's 5% AEB penetration. Okay? If in a year it's not going faster enough or not working, we can rule make. All those tools remain available. And I think that's what the challenge is for a lot of folks is what like, what's the list? How do we get them out there? Right? And that's why I think Nat gave you probably two of the great examples of how do we get this technology in our vehicles as soon as we can. And he actually raised something we haven't talked at all about that's critical is what about the retrofit? What you've only heard alluded to is 265 million vehicles. The average age nowadays is 11.5 years. So how long does it take for the fleet to turn over? 20 to 30 years. So while we can talk about the new car stuff and get it as quickly as we can, I always say this, Ron can have a perfect autonomous vehicle tomorrow for you. You can't have it. I mean, he might give you one, but what's the concern? It takes a while to get this new technology, even one, let alone a fully, right? So we have to balance all of those, we together, to balance all of those, because I keep going back to the numbers, right? That should not, 32,675 is equivalent to a 747 crashing every week. That happens once, and then we close the whole aviation system down, right? And yet we've been letting that go on for decades as acceptable. Okay? It is not. So we got to figure out, when we are this close to all these technologies that we know can make a difference, we got to figure out how to get them saving lives now. And it was said, but 40%, AAB could eliminate 40% of rear end crashes, 23% of front end. Those are numbers we cannot avoid. We got to run into them in a constructive, positive way, right? So
I have another one.
Go.
So I'm on the board of the National Board for the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and the DADS technology that you talked about earlier is, it's been in development now for about 10 years, and I'd love to see us push that into cars and really have an impact on reducing this terrible toll that drunk driving has on our society. It really screams for this kind of technology, frankly.
And I'm going to add where I started, driver state detection. Many of the suppliers have systems that are fairly production ready. Auto manufacturers are not willing to bite the bullet on the cost yet. But I do think if we look at the drowsy and distracted side of the equation, as well as the future needs to cohesive attention management and automation, it's a starting place. Even if you can take the egregious distraction off the equation instantly, it's a simple fix.
So we have time for a couple more questions quickly. One, closer, great.
Hi,
And then we're back to you guys, so be ready.
My name is Eileen McDonald. I'm a faculty member in the Injury Center, and I want to take the opportunity to play the Luddite at the technology conference. As I was listening very actively to this wonderful conversation, I had episodes of the Jetsons theme song in my head, along with, for some reason, some Lee Iacocca documentary was running through my head too, and thinking about how central to the American psyche the car is, and the freedom and individuality that conveys. So I'm wondering just if you are underestimating the potential backlash by certain segments of the population and how you see this playing out.
So mine is Knight Rider. But I bet if we asked those two young girls right there what their perspective would be different than yours. I'm sure.
Can either of you tell us what the Jetsons are?
Or Knight Rider? Yeah, probably not.
Those two young girls were like, why are they talking to us in the middle of this? Actually, I'm curious. Everyone who doesn't know who the Jetsons are, hands? All right, there you go.
Sing the theme song?
Yeah.
Here comes Judy. No.
There you go.
I've got 4 kids.
Rosie.
What we do. No, I mean, I think so. It's a question of where people are in any one given time. I mean, I think just had this conversation with my dad on Sunday. I don't want no car to drive me. Okay, Dad.
Don't listen to him, man.
Yeah. So I think it's just a matter of, much like what Ron said, if you experience it, it's different than just thinking about what it really is. I'm a big believer in sort of getting in something and trying it out before I run around and start preaching it. So like crash avoidance technologies, I have them all in my car. Why? Because I want to know how they work in the real world, not just what my guys showed me on the test track or what I experienced in the test track. And it matters, right? I mean, it matters when you are in a scenario that you probably would have hit somebody if it were not for that singular piece of technology. So it is sort of that fear that there might be this huge backlash, but I also think that put in proper perspective of the 32,675 people, all of which probably everybody in this room has had an experience either personally in their life of someone being, God forbid, killed or injured in a car crash, but definitely someone they know for sure. And that's how pervasive it is. And I think if you can hold up technologies in general, including those that will get us to full self-driving or full self-driving right away, that's a tremendous, tremendous benefit to society. I mean, I've had to sit through, and Ron was at the agency at the time, when you had to listen to people who run over their kids in a back-over crash. I mean, it's the most horrifying thing because these are the people that actually parents, loved ones of these kids who couldn't love them anymore. And to know that there was a technology available that they could have used to sort of address that, not a one of them would have said, oh, I don't want that technology because I'm never going to use it, right? So I think it is a lot about experiencing the technology and not having to experience the personal tragedy.
I think so. I love cars. One of the cool parts of my job, we have a Revs program at Stanford, and this has allowed us to instrument some vintage race cars from the 1960s, a Ford GT40, a Corvette Grand Sport. And the 1960s were just an amazing time for automobiles, and sort of forged this image of the automobile as being part of the American psyche. But if we think about it, if you go back earlier in the 1920s and 30s, most people didn't own cars. If you did, then you probably didn't drive it yourself. And so if we think about this individual car ownership representing mobility, that's actually only a blip in time on the U.S. experience. And yeah, I could not wait to get my license because it meant I could be with my friends. But now actually, I've got the ability to be with my friends, as do my kids. And so I think, honestly, much as I hate to admit it, because again, I still haven't gone to the automatic transmission. I love old cars, but the fact is that it's not necessarily, I think, as ingrained. I think the freedom aspect, as we talked with students in our classes at Stanford about automated vehicles and what does the future of driving look like for you, they're thinking of, I don't want that commute. I don't want to be stuck in traffic. The open roads aren't so open, and I think that's I'm nostalgic for the times of driving on the wide open road, but I don't think it represents reality anymore, and I think that's changing.
So we're going to wrap and let them have one line. So whatever it is you'd like to leave everybody with, your last comment before we wrap this up. Why don't we start with Bryan and work our way to Nat?
I think we got to start taking a step back and beginning to look beyond sensing outside the vehicle. And as I mentioned earlier, looking inside, looking at the human as a center piece of cohesive automation, either as an occupant doing something completely new or as an occupant who has responsibilities. Let's start focusing on the people we're trying to move around.
I wasn't counting if that was one line, but we'll keep it fast. Go ahead, Ron.
I would ask you to look back 100 years and think about when we made the transition from horses to cars. And the transition that we want to make now for transformational purposes is like now getting rid of the driver, and it's going to have the same kind of impact on our society, I think.
I agree. I'm going to follow up on that. This changes everything. And if we think about, for instance, driver's licenses and what goes into that today, that's how we register people for voting, organ donation, our sense of identity goes through that. All of this is going to have to change. It's going to touch every field that all of you represent. The best ideas in the world are really necessary to make sure everybody gets this right. So please jump in. It's not too early.
A lot of comments, but commas rather. But
it was a lot of comments.
That's okay. Matt, it's all yours. Bring it home.
Well, so I'm an engineer, so I'm going to join the comma crowd. Just kidding. I would say, don't panic. Join the conversation. There's a lot of smart people working on this.
Excellent. Listen, folks, these are four of the most significant voices working in this area. Please join me in thanking them for this. Them to move. They can.
I just have a couple of important announcements. Probably the most important is there's a wonderful reception out in the gallery, but you need a ticket. So if you didn't get your ticket when you registered, please see Edith, who will be standing out there in the hall to give you a ticket, and we would welcome you to join us so we can continue this exciting conversation. And it was really a stimulating discussion, and I just want to close out by thanking the sponsors who made today's event possible. Of course, the Raskin family, first and foremost, along with the Department of Health Policy and Management, the Department of Health Behavior and Society, the Institute for Health and Social Policy, and the Whiting School of Engineering. And I also want to thank and acknowledge all the people who work behind the scenes to bring this event together. The school's logistical and media support have been really appreciated and instrumental in pulling this together. And our department had outstanding support from Edith Jones, our center administrator, Mary Ann Bailey, center assistant director for training and education, and our communications associate, Susan Murrow, in the department, and Eric Schulman in our center. So I'm grateful that you were all here, and I know everyone enjoyed this wonderful afternoon. So please join me again in thanking Dr. Rosekind, Mr. Beuse, Mr. Medford, Dr. Reimer, and Dr. Gerdes. Thank you.